Little background before the story. All four of the Gospels in the Bible report that Joseph of Arimathea offered his own tomb for Jesus. We don't know his motives, but it was an act of kindness that was never forgotten. The message this morning is a story postulating a fictional reporter from a fictional zealot newspaper who would like to have an interview with Joseph, because Joseph was a member of the council. The zealots were nearly fanatical. They sought to free Israel from Rome. Their efforts would result in a bloody uprising decades after the death of Jesus. Rome would crush Israel. Until that time, the Jewish people had enjoyed a few special privileges from Rome because they were useful. They were useful people. They were far more literate than the average. But after the zealot uprising, Rome lost its patience and the Jewish people lost their status. Daniel sat in the marketplace waiting for his friend Abraham, who was a servant in the household of Joseph of Arimathea. There was Abraham, with some hours of freedom at the end of a long day of work. Daniel stood and hobbled forward. His limp and other health problems were why he worked for the newspaper, the Israel Purpose, rather than fulfilling the dream of his parents and becoming a freedom soldier for the zealot movement. They never said outright that they were disappointed in him, but it didn't take a brilliant observer to see they felt more pride in their other children. Even his siblings' names, all of them, told what they'd expected. His brother was Eleazar, for one of the Maccabeans who'd fought for freedom in an earlier time. His sisters were Susanna and Esther, because their namesakes had been valiant fighters against the enemies of Israel. Daniel's name, though, was a burden to him. They had called him for the man who stood up to oppression and triumphantly faced the lions in their den. He thought that by becoming a writer for the zealot newspaper, his family would see he was fighting also. Then it hadn't worked out. For them, things had to be a certain way. Abraham raised an eyebrow as they sat with a cup of wine. "You need an interview with Joseph, don't you?" "Yes, but I know you can't help me see him. I told my editor that, but he said to try." Daniel grinned weakly. "At least it gives me an excuse to sit and relax." His friend nodded, looking relieved. Daniel understood. It seemed as if every zealot he knew at the newspaper and elsewhere thought it was all right to do anything, no matter what, to get what you wanted. Using a friend would seem minor. They did plenty of other things that created what sometimes they call collateral damage. They gave lip service to being sorry that some people got hurt, but would conclude that their goal was too important and that sometimes there had to be sacrifices for the greater good. It sounded fine, until Daniel saw innocent people who had no choice in the matter be the ones who were hurt. Was that right? Would God really approve? He didn't think all zealots felt that way, but whenever he'd ventured those questions, his co-workers and family stared at him with incomprehension and distaste. "Would it help," Abraham asked, "to have an anonymous source you could quote? I really don't know much, but I wouldn't mind so long as my name wasn't used." Daniel and Abraham had been friends for most of their lives, and Abraham knew the struggles that Daniel had had. The problem was not knowing whether the editor would respect Abraham's anonymity. Well, perhaps he would. If the paper started naming anonymous sources, those sources would dry up in a hurry. "We'll give it a try," Daniel said. "Thanks." "I figure it's about that crucifixion this morning," Abraham said. "What do they want to know?" The newspapers actually wanted to know everything. Jesus had been fascinating to the zealots. After all, they knew he had both zealots and a tax collector amongst his closest, most trusted disciples. That seemed almost impossible. Zealots were fanatic against the Romans, while the tax collectors were collaborators with them. Still, some zealots had believed Jesus would be the catalyst for the great uprising that would free the nation. But the rumors said he'd ordered his followers to put away their swords when he was arrested. "Well," Daniel said, "there are questions about the council. Their actions were highly irregular." "Yeah," Abraham agreed. "They broke a lot of their own rules to try to bring Jesus down." Did Joseph help plot the whole thing out? Abraham seemed puzzled. No, he's upset by what happened. You know, he went to Pilate to ask for the body, and he offered his own tomb to bury it. Really? Daniel said, that took some courage. Daniel admired courage and often wondered where it came from and, well, how did you get it? I suppose it did take courage, Abraham said. The servants are all gossiping. Some say that he just cared about the Sabbath and not letting the land be tainted by having the body hanging there. Well, that wasn't an awful motive. Daniel knew that there were those who cared more about ritual than people, but some folks were genuinely spiritual. Well, Daniel said, there were 3 men crucified, and I heard that they hastened the deaths of all so they wouldn't hang there on the Sabbath. Did all 3 get buried in Joseph's tomb? No, he only asked for Jesus. Well, Daniel decided that piety, even genuine spirituality, wouldn't explain what Joseph had done. If he'd cared just about the image of the body and the defilement of the land, he'd have worried about burying the others who'd been crucified that day. But apparently he'd only asked for Pilate for Jesus' body, and then he'd given his own tomb for him. That seemed like someone who'd actually cared about Jesus. Well, it could be someone with a guilty conscience. If Joseph had helped get him crucified, he might have been sorry afterwards. Did Joseph vote to convict Jesus? Daniel asked. Abraham shook his head. To be honest, none of us know if he was even there at the council meeting. Some think he was excluded because they knew he wouldn't approve. Some think he was there and kept silent, knowing it wouldn't do any good to object. But others say he must have tried and failed to change their decision. The one thing we do know is that he didn't approve of what they did. Wow. Daniel didn't know what would be the saddest of those possible scenarios. No, he did know. The worst was being afraid to speak up and then having to wonder afterwards if he could have made a difference. That was the issue Daniel was beginning to wonder about himself. If he raised moral questions about how the zealots were doing things, if he objected to the idea of sacrificing others for their cause, well, he wasn't sure if he'd be heard, and he was quite sure he'd be fired from his job, ostracized by most of the people he knew, and hardest of all by his family. Look what had happened to Jesus. He hadn't been silent. He'd taken bold stands and actions. He hadn't played along with the zealots. Instead, he talked about forgiveness and even loving your enemy. Daniel had seen him in the temple and was so impressed. Jesus still hadn't played along with the powerful elite in Israel, pointing out their hypocrisy and their lack of caring for others. Jesus hadn't sided with anyone except God and with love. No, he'd ended up on a cross. Well, all those thoughts had been racing through Daniel's mind. Abraham had been sipping his wine and watching a puppy play. Daniel leaned forward. Did Joseph say anything about what happened? Nothing I've heard. I told you that I didn't know much, just that he wasn't happy about what the council and the Romans did. So, Daniel said, he did what he could. He gave Jesus a proper burial, and he gave the best that he had for it. Right. Sorry, I didn't have more than that to tell you. Daniel lifted his shoulders. Maybe it's enough. For me, at least. They emptied their cups, and Abraham left to spend the rest of the evening with his family. And Daniel considered the article he was planning. It was going to be about an act of kindness in the face of cruelty. He was going to write about the possibilities of changing the world through goodness and caring. The editor would completely change it or pull the article altogether. They probably wouldn't fire him for it. From now on, he might be sent on meaningless assignments. He prayed that he'd have the grace not to regret his choices. Pulling out his notebook, he started to write. Why? Why isn't goodness considered worthy of being the news? Amen.